let's start with identity, then go transitions, and then see where we end up. So, Miriam, where would you start when I say the word identity?
I might ask the question of what's the disparity between who you really believe yourself to be and know yourself to be, and who other people believe you to be and know you to be.
Eric?
I think that's definitely like a huge point there, Miriam. But for me, I think identity is something that, at least I speak from experience, at least from like the US and sort of like the Western culture perspective of like, most people actually don't know who they are. And when you ask, who are you? It's filled with what's. I'm, a project manager, I'm a consultant, I'm a teacher, or, it's all these things that are on top, like very surface level, and there's nothing that goes like down to the core of that person.
Yeah. I sort of like resonate with a lot of what you both said. And I think think about identity, it's probably not that important to talk about the doing, because that changes all the time. And I don't think it truly represents our core, like what gets presented to the world isn't, and that can just change, like I probably used to identify as a rugby player, but chances are if I was born in the US or North America, it might have been, American football or hockey or something. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that the thing that is kind of the behavior or the doing at the end of it is anything to do with my core. So I think it's identity is probably in terms of, it's probably our essence, our like the most core part of our being. It's the being. And I have said this, maybe even said it to Miriam on our podcast, but I don't think I get to choose what that is. I'm just presented with it. So I don't think I really get to choose my identity. But to Miriam's point, the disparity between who I feel I am and who other people see me as, I think who other people see me as is probably what I choose to show them. And that probably creates a disparity when my ego decides, oh shit, I better show them this side of me or whatever. So I don't think what people see me as is probably the truest version of my identity. Does anyone have any to build off that? Or?
Well, I want to push on this a little bit, because there is personality, and I don't know that people's personalities actually change. There's been enough research to talk about kind of who you are at birth is kind of who you are. And anybody who has kids, even twins, will say, from the second they were born, they were like this, whatever that is. But then this identity piece, I actually think can be changed, because I'm working all the time on becoming the best version of myself. And if you looked at the version of me 20 years ago, she was doing the very best she could, but I did not have the same kind of input that I'm having now. And even after this call that many of us were on yesterday, we're part of a platform. I got into the platform and I commented to Rich, I'm shocked at how many tiny shifts have these long-ranging effects on who it is that I am showing up as. And Callum, you and I have not had this conversation yet, but down the road, and not in this podcast, I want to have a conversation about the athlete's mindset, because that's an identity that I want to embrace and own, but actually don't at all. And, as you look at people in, before you were an Olympic swimmer and then after you're an Olympic swimmer, that really changes. Even though that's a doing thing, it changes how you think about yourself, or the attorney who was, going through school and they win their first case, that really changes how they think about themselves. Or, a law enforcement officer who arrests their first person or has to shoot their first person, that changes how they think about themselves. And there's this space of, who am I really? Which goes to what you were saying, Eric. So many people don't actually even know.
Yeah. Yeah, like I think so much of like, I agree with what you're saying, Miriam, of like so much of what we do can shape some of that identity. But I think, and I'll speak just from my experience where, not having a sense of like who you are, or going through a transition, probably something that we'll talk about as well, where something so core and fundamental that you believed about yourself is now gone. And you're left with this sense of like, who am I?
Yeah.
You can find yourself taking on tasks or projects or jobs or whatever it might be, just because somebody said, I think you would do good at this. So it's like for myself, like that's how I got into project management. I was in an account management style role, very people oriented, relationship based. And I was doing these side projects for my team. And my manager, who I love to death, it's like she was one of the most influential people in my life, said, hey, we're creating this new role, doing all these projects that you've been doing, but for larger teams, all you have to do is say yes. And so it's like, I took that identity that she saw in me of like, oh, I can do these things, and adopted it and became miserable. Because I didn't know who I was. I didn't know that like this style of work or this type of engagement was, going to be counterintuitive to me. Yeah.
I was thinking about when I spoke to James, he described that what we're doing as coaches is chipping away, like in Michelangelo's. Oh, he's
Yeah, it was Michelangelo who
right.
said it.
Chipping away, and that's why I believe that when we are thinking about identity, it's not about adding things to how we describe ourselves. It's removing stuff. And to your point about Eric, about, I don't know, I got this idea of the fragility of identifying as a doing, because a lot of sportsmen on the athlete's mindset thing, the trouble is you see yourself as a sportsman, we get injured and you can't play sports for 6 months, and they literally have an identity crisis. They feel less worthy. It's too fragile. And and anything that can get taken away from you, I suppose, in some sense, it tells me it probably isn't your identity, because it's so fragile. But I also think that you're also saying, well, if I took that away from you, then you're less. But I don't think that's true. Like if neither of you two coached again, I wouldn't think of you as less as human beings. So although you might identify as coaches, I don't think that is your identity as much as, you see what I'm saying. And I was thinking about this question. It got posed on a rugby player, a very famous rugby player's podcast, Johnny Wilkinson, and he was talking to someone, and they said your best bet at probably describing who you are, which I guess you could say is identity, would be but try and do it without referring to the past. So you're not allowed to refer to history, and all you're probably left with is your values, and even those can change. So I thought that's like an interesting take. Eric, to your point about someone else telling you who you are, I think that like and sort of speak to Miriam's idea of like choosing to be different, is that I wonder if you do it, when you say you choose, but that idea of who I want to now be isn't something where I sit there and go, I now want to be like that. It's just in my head. I'm like, oh, I want to be more like that. And it doesn't really feel like I'm deciding on what that direction goes in. So I sort of feel like that in some form, like I'm just like an open state that things get pushed into, and then I feel what feels right and then go with that. And I know you guys are potentially religious, and I know you've got a religious background, and maybe you feel like God's giving you your identity or that sense. For me, it's just kind of like nature telling me, oh, this is what you should do right now. And so, yeah, I guess for me, it's probably the essence of us, which is nature, and that sort of isn't decided, but there are ways that it repeatedly shows up. Certain parts of the purest version of me, and it gets expressed through behaviors, but it's very, on a core level, it's always the same kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think one of the struggles in this conversation is that we're almost forcing ourselves to get into a binary space of, is it static or is it changeable? And so many aspects, I'm going to go with, are both. My entire life, I've been incredibly intentional, and that part of my identity, whether we want to use the word God-given or nature-given or by birth or by personality, I've always been intentional, way more than anyone else in my nuclear family has been. And how that shows up throughout my lifespan has been really different. But if we don't believe that we can change our identity, then why are we coaches, and what are we helping people do? And I look at how my intentionality shifts and changes. It's always, I want to be the best version of me. But at this stage of my life, I'm finding out that there are deeper and deeper and deeper layers of intentionality that I didn't even know existed. And I'm pursuing that and wanting that. And so at some point, I'm putting effort into expanding my ideas of who I am. Somebody, and I'm trying to think, well, I mean, many coaches have this sense of this statement, I'm the kind of person who. You can kind of find out some of your identity. How would you answer that question? I'm the kind of person who, and can you change that? So I'm the kind of person who's intentional. I'm the kind of person who's kind. I'm the kind of person who values animals and wants to rescue them. I'm the kind of person who believes in sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. I am the kind of person who wants to think that movement is important, but I do not yet embody that. But I believe that place can change, which is why I want to have this conversation down the road with you, Callum, because you know already, you know that movement is important. And I know that by standing close to you, the heat of that flame will ignite my ideas and actions on fire. So that's a piece of my identity I don't yet possess, but I know I can become that.
Okay. Eric, do you have a response to that?
Well, I was thinking, like, as you were talking about that, you use the concept of the layers, and instantly my mind went to sort of like the onion. There's so many layers to who we are as humans in our identity. And it's like, you may never, like, as you peel those layers back, you may never actually get to the center of the onion. It's like, but that process, but that process isn't going to be easy as well. It's like, it's going to involve potentially some tears, some emotion, some like, you're cutting up an onion. It's just like, you can't help but cry because that's what onions do to you.
Yeah.
So like, I think that's important. It's like, I think the journey of identity is just that. It's a journey. It's like, there may never be a finish line. There may never be that like, I have found this is who I am, because who you are can change depending on the situation you're in. You know, whether it's like, you know, you're coming from a sports background, you get injured or you retire. Great. Who am I now? Let's dig deeper. Okay, now I'm a coach. Let's dig deeper. I no longer want to coach. I want to go do this other thing. Like let's keep digging. So it's like, I think there's so much. I think where I'm coming from is just like, so many people stop digging. They identify as this one thing.
Yeah.
You know, whether it be a profession, a religion, a family member, like whatever it might be. And, you know, they become rigid, they become binary. I'm this, not that. And it's like, you got to find that sort of that balance between, it's like, it's okay to say I'm this for now. But what happens tomorrow when, you know, someone dies, or you lose your job, or you break your leg or whatever, and you can no longer say that I'm this? Like, do you have the steps? Do you have the tools to be able to say, okay, who am I now? How do I dig deeper?
Yeah, I totally really resonate with that. And I'm reminded of, have you read Steve Hardison's book, The Ultimate Coach?
Not yet. It's on the shelf on my to-do list.
Blimey, it's good. He does something called The Document, and I am something I've introduced with my clients recently, it is kind of the reason I'm reminded of it is because I want to say this out loud, but like, I am you and you are me and we are all nature. I think on my most essential level, we are nature and I am nature. And nature's evolving and fluid and changing, and to get stuck in one space is to deny me of what I think I am most fundamentally, which is part of something much bigger, and that is constantly changing. Like, the world changes all the time and I'm part of it. So to not change would be to deny my unity with all of us. And then to your point, Miriam, the funny thing is that whilst I'm saying I don't think you choose, and you're saying you do get to choose, I think we're saying the same thing. And I'd put it like this: but your decision to go, oh, I want to introduce this to my life, where did that come from?
Yeah.
That inspired
I've thought about that a lot.
I want to be an athlete. I want to have an athlete's mindset. You probably didn't sit there and go, I'm going to want to be an athlete. It just came to you, right? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I think I would be content to be a slug my whole life, but as I age, it's not good for me. Like, I'm finding these various things going away. And
Yes.
so my motivation for this athlete's mindset is that I want to live a healthy life, and I want my brain to work properly, and I want my body to work properly. And that motivation has only come because those things are starting to go away, you know? So, uh, the forces outside of me are generating this motivation,
That's what
you
I'm
know. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. I'll go with you there then.
No, I'm not trying to force that we're the same, but I'm saying that want is just like, you're sitting there one day and you're like, holy, I really want to start moving, or like, I want to keep doing those things. And it's kind of in that, like, in the subconscious, that this idea comes in. It's like, oh geez, I feel cool to start moving, or I feel, and then you have the choice to get in line with what you're being called to do, or not. And I think that's probably I wrote down unveiling. I feel like as we get a bit like the onion, it's just kind of an unveiling of the purest sense. And I said on another one of these that, like, imagine if we're a circle, and I think this is the next stage before I go of identity, is like, in our purest form, we're this complete whole thing, and then our ego cuts off sections, and what we're doing as coaches and as people, quite often, like you could say, peeling the onion, or is just like allowing ourselves to go into those areas. Kirsten, as I said in a podcast before, said remember or reintegrate. It's that thing, that athlete is already in you, Miriam, I'm sure. And all that we'll do in our conversation is allow you to see how it's already in you. Because I'm definitely not going to be adding anything to you in that conversation. I was going to allow that part of you to go, yeah, shit, that's me as well. I don't know how that conversation is going to play out, but that's my sense anyhow. It's not an adding thing. It's an unveiling of the truest form. And I think that, you know, in one world we call it athlete, and another world we might call it mover or whatever. We can define it lots of different ways, but yeah, Eric, what are you thinking? By the way, loving all this challenge and different thinking. It's really nice.
Yeah, so it's like I'm thinking about my own life in, you know, specifically, it's like behind me I've got guitars on the wall. In my bedroom I've got a drum set in the closet. Like this sense of like music plays such a huge part of who I am. Where did that come from? You know, sort of playing the tape back, like this is who I am today. How did I get to this point? And I think a lot of it had to do with the environment that I was raised in. My mom was a piano teacher out of our home for 14 years. So it's like basically from birth, there was always live music being played in the house. You know, at 5 years old, I said, hey, I want to learn how to play this. And my mom started teaching me how to play piano. And had my mom not been a piano teacher, would I still be a musician today? I don't know. You know, it's like in college, I had an accident and I had a torn ligament in my thumb and I had to have surgery. And it was painful, almost impossible to be able to hold a drumstick or a guitar pick. And I was afraid of losing that part of my identity. Will I ever be able to play music again? Will I ever be able to experience life with all the joy that music gives me? Thankfully, you know, through rehab and, you know, one of the top surgeons in the world on hands, I was able to like jump right back into where I was and keep going. So I think your environment that you're in definitely shapes that part of you, that identity, whether it's conscious or unconscious.
Yeah, I think we're jumping into that nature nurture question that so many people wrestle with. And it would be a fascinating question to find out, if you were raised in a musicless home, would you have had a passion for that once you left, you know? And would you pursue it? Some people do. It's in them, and some people don't.
Yeah, it's like I don't ever remember like listening to music as like a favorite pastime until I was 16 years old. And I was trying to figure out, what do I do for my 16th birthday? And my sister's like, oh, you should go to a concert. I had never thought of going to a concert before. Like, so I grabbed some of my friends and, you know, I went to my very first like punk rock show in this little dingy club here in Seattle. And I was just like, instantly I was in love. Like I was stage diving, crowd surfing, moshing, like just like a part of me was awakened in that moment because somebody else influenced me to do it. You know, it's like, I think that's also part of like this sense of identity is sometimes I think like I have to figure out my identity by myself. When in reality, who I am is not an individual sport, it's a team sport. You know, it's like my sister was a huge influence on my musical journey. My mom was a huge influence on my musical journey. You know, it's like you both are a huge influence on my coaching journey. You know, it's, you know, you have to be open to other people's input and influence and impact, you know, to allow them to nurture you into finding that true sense of who you are.
I love that sentence. Identity is a team sport. I really can appreciate that. And we do try and go it alone, and it is pretty difficult. So many people, you know, influencers and coaches and whoever say, you are the product of the 5 people you spend the most time with, so choose those people carefully. I don't know that that might necessarily create or unveil that space, Callum, you're talking about of identity, but they definitely influence. And I was thinking about um, therapists and coaches look for what is constraining you from this thing that you think you want to be or pursue, and how can I help you remove those constraints? And then there's this other space where James said on one of the conversation he had with you, Callum, um, he wants to ignite people. What did you say? Something like ignite intentional growth. And again, there's that team sport feeling of, if I stand close enough to you and my life and words can challenge you and ignite you, you have the potential to become something other than what you are right now. And I find that to be like, that's so motivating. That's why I do what I do, for that potential that you can become something other than you are, not in the doing, but in the being space.
Steve Hardison on his document, just to, because I kind of forgot, one of the first things I seem to remember him saying is, "I am the universe," and he might even say, "I am God." But what I understand that to mean is that, like, I'm part of the team, like we're all in this together. And I honestly think I don't think in my core I'm separate to you. So that's why I said I am you and you are me. I think I am nature, and that is that team. And you know, and all those, you've got to think all those 5 people that you surround yourself with are influenced by 5 people who are influenced by 5, you know, and it's all just a circulation of this and connection of this shared knowledge and stuff. So I think on the most core level, I'm not an individual. I am part of everything. And I thought this was really interesting, that this nature nurture, because I thought, but like, I've never ever thought of this before, and it's quite fun to discuss with you guys. But like, nurture, which you could say is the influence of other people, is an expression of nature, if you consider that everyone is part of nature anyhow. So, you know, am I just tricking myself here? Is nurture actually nature? Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah.
I know what we understand. Like, if you left me on my own, what would I decide to do? But then everyone is part of nature in my mind. So that, like, they're just expressions of it. I want to be like really clear at this point that I really do not believe in determinism. I think that each of us have a choice each time we open our mouths and move our bodies in who we are being. Like, we get to choose. And for me, it's normally the choice between the separate self and the ego that's probably going to tell me to, like, oh, just agree and be really nice. Or there's the me, which is like not personal, that's like, that just feels like the right thing to say, which is what I'm trying to flow through right now. And I think we always have a choice in who we are. And we can bow down to our separation and the fear that feels with us, or we can step up and get in line with nature. Really interested to talk about, well, we don't have to, but this nature nurture, because I've never thought that the nurture is potentially the very natural thing anyhow. So anyone want to riff off me there?
Well, one of the things like that came to mind is like this choice of, like, we have the choice, you know, but I think to some extent, most people realize they have a choice of identifying and showing up how they want to. But I think there's the fear of, like, if I show up as my true authentic self, will I be accepted? Will I be rejected by the herd? You know, it's like, am I too weird? Am I too out there? Am I too this, too that? You know, it's like, oh, I identified, you know, religiously over here in 1 year, and then all of a sudden, like, that's completely gone. And now it's like, am I still going to be accepted by these people? Like, I think there's that element of, like, choice, what people struggle with is the fear of sort of acceptance and rejection of just who they really are. You know, am I just going to be accepted, or do I continue to put on a front, you know, for other people so that I'm at least accepted, but I'm miserable inside?
Yeah. I was talking to Anna earlier today, and we were like, where do you think you are on your journey in life? And I was like, oh, probably 25%. I just don't know. I just chose a funny number. And but it was because before I came on this coaching journey, although there was a choice, I didn't really understand which part of the choice was me and which part of the choice was the fear, the ego, worrying. So I was sort of like, I had this internal battle going on, this hypocrisy, which is like, I'm presenting one thing, but inside I feel like something else. But I didn't really understand what those two things were. And I know other people feel like they've got more than two at times. I didn't, and to sort of rewind to the start, Eric, I don't think I really knew the truest version of me, which is that secondary, clear feeling of right. Until I became aware, even just having the language, or like a bit of Eckhart Tolle or whoever, you know, just go, oh, that's the reactor, or that's the observer. And you're like, oh, okay. And then I've suddenly been able to start to see who I am more and more and more. And it in being able to at least to have language and an awareness around what's going, awareness really is the key, right? But once I got an awareness around it, who is making what choice, whether it's the separate self or the true me, and then the choice becomes much easier. In the past, I bowed down to fear quite often, but I didn't really understand on a big scale how consequential that choice can be, really, because live enough to the fear and geez, you've wasted a life. Miriam, any thoughts?
Well, when you were talking about this, I was thinking about the word congruent, and I had a decade of my life that I spent really trying to get my insides to match my outsides. And it really speaks, it's a different way of speaking to what you're talking about. But the one, you know, your external physical body, words, posture are saying one thing, and inside your head is screaming, or your heart is screaming another thing. Bringing those two things in congruence is a difficult thing that many, many people actually never achieve. And once you get a taste of congruence, you feel so powerful because you're like in alignment with yourself. And that is a gift I think we can help our clients and our friends and ourselves continually pursue. It kind of is going back to that all of me space, bringing all of me to all of you. That's not talking, there's discretion. There are certain things that don't need to be said or don't need to be done. But in the space of being wise, understanding congruence, and I'm going to bounce back to some of the coaching things we've been learning with Rich about not having a vested interest in how the other person responds, whether that's putting out a proposal or that is asking a coaching question. And he says often, I don't need to be right. I'm trying to be provocative. And so I'm wondering, Eric, as you're talking, and maybe this is a good place to transition into transitions, but you know, there is a space when you held the religious identity where you were very concerned with what they thought about you. Then there was a space where you knew you were in direct opposition. And I don't know if you're in a space where you don't have a vested interest in what they think, whoever they are. And obviously those rungs of, the closer they are to your central people, the more you care about what they think. But as you get further and further out into those rings, you get stronger at saying, this is me, this is where I am, and it's okay if you think or believe something differently. You know, that now you're in congruence with yourself, and it allows you to be in a space where you care more about what you think and feel about how you're acting or reacting or interacting than you care about how they're perceiving what you're doing, thinking, being. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I like that sort of that sense of congruence where it's like you feel an alignment, you know, with yourself. Like you feel the most alive, you feel the most energetic. And it's like, yeah, so it's like using some of my story, especially like religion was such a huge part of my growing up. You know, like that's who I was. That was my identity. And as I grew older and started to allow myself to ask my own questions versus just being fed, this is what I am to believe, you know, some of those things started chipping away and falling apart. And I actively fought that for the longest time, because the more I felt like things were falling apart, the less in alignment I felt with myself. So that was scary. You know, it's like I didn't want to feel out of congruency. I didn't want to feel out of alignment with myself. But it got to a point where it's like who I was and who I said I was were so far apart that everything inside felt both empty, terrifying, like just like all of these miserable feelings. And it's just like, okay, how do I bring these things back together? And they're not going to land in the same spot that they were, you know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Where am I bringing that sense of who I am today? How am I transitioning that today? So yeah, like, especially with like the people around me, like that was terrifying at first. The simple act of being asked to pray for a meal, like felt like I was being ripped apart on the inside, because I'm like, am I saying these words because that's what I'm being told, or am I saying these words because that's what I believe? And as I was able to sort of, you know, come into alignment with myself and open myself up to the people specifically in my core circle, there was that acceptance. You know, it's like they may not fully believe it or understand it or like it, but they don't not love me. And so it's like, I think that's part of the, when you would talk about transitions, is it's so scary to transition from one thing to another because of that like community fear of being rejected. Some people do get rejected, and that's sad. But some people have a tight community that, whether they understand it or not, can come around them and continue that sort of nurture, sort of nature nurture, sort of like, you're a different person now, but we still love you.
Yeah, I was thinking about the word congruency, and I bounce between congruency, alignment, nature, I think, and then I was thinking about determinism and choice. And I think if I was to sum it up, I guess we've got a choice to be congruent. And what congruency is, and that feeling is just in me, but I do have a choice to follow that through. Like potentially, Miriam, congruency is within you, is to find the athlete within you, and then you have the choice to follow through with that or not. And so that's where I think the choice is, and that's what I'm saying in terms of like my decision to be whoever I want to be, whether or not nurture's told me to be a certain way, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I guess the choice to be congruent feels right in terms of what we're speaking about there. And then Eric, just wanted to speak a little bit about what you were saying, and potentially spoken to Miriam about it before or not, but Adler speaks around task separation, which I think is such a powerful thing to get your head around, or to sort of like understand. And task separation is understanding whose task anything is, and the way we know whose task it is by whoever has to like live with the consequences of it. So when you're going to telling someone who like what you're doing or what you do and don't believe, there's part of you that wants them to like you and agree with whatever you identify with, or but that's not your task. It's their task to decide what they think about you. And I think too often in life we try and play God in some sense and manipulate people into liking us through our words, and it's not your task to decide even what your family think about you. And I'm not saying that it doesn't mean it's not hard, but like in this conversation, my only task is to express, my only task is to choose to be congruent in this conversation. What you guys make of that, like, I'm not here to manipulate you to like me or whatever. I think because like I want to come from love, hopefully we're just gonna feel great after this anyhow. But I think it's always important to remember that, like, shit, when I start to like make people like me, I'm trying to play God, I'm trying to play creator, I'm manipulating, and then I'm like, oh, that's a bit creepy. Like, should step away from that. That's a bit out of my lane. I'm not saying you're creepy, by the way, but do you see what I mean? Like, I spent a whole lifetime in trying to make people think a certain way about me, respect me, and it's just like, it's their fucking decision, and they're the people that will suffer that, whatever it is. If they hate me, like, they're the ones that suffer hate, like, not me. Do you see what I'm saying?
Right. No, absolutely. And that was something that I struggled to learn with, like my transition out of religion, was just like, I was such a people pleaser. Like, oh, you need something done, I'll do it so that you think good about me. Oh, like, I can take care of that. Oh, I'll take care of that. You need the house cleaned, I'll do it. Like, it didn't matter. Like, I was just like, let me do the thing, because I was seeking that sort of validation. Because like, I look back on it now, so it's like so much of my identity was wrapped up into other people's opinions of me. And so I would do everything I could to sort of feel that dopamine hit of acceptance or love or whatever. And it wasn't until I started to realize, do I love myself? That I could start breaking out of those patterns of sort of like seeking validation. And that was so difficult, because it was just like, every time, I would talk with like my therapist about like, what if my family members find out that I no longer believe in the religion that they brought me up with? And he's like, what's the worst that could happen? I'm like, they kick me out of the family, like, no contact. And he's like, yep, that's probably the worst thing that can happen. But, you can't control that.
Yeah.
You can't control if they kick you out, or if they love you, or if nothing happens. All you can control is what you do.
So I want to bounce in here for a second, because on one level, yeah, your therapist was right. You can't control that. But on another level, what you absolutely knew is you totally could control that by living a false thing, by keeping yourself separate, by having the discongruence or uncongruence or incongruence. You could be certain you could stay in the family and be, I'm going to put this in air quotes, and be loved, and for you to become congruent and say, I don't believe this anymore, is probably one of the largest risks of your life. And I think inside us, there's this internal teeter-totter. And initially, maybe things are closer to the fulcrum and they balance out. And you're like, no, well, I would say over time, no, the desire to be loved and accepted and be false is a little heavier, and that's tipped the teeter-totter. And as you continue to do your work and continue to grow, you were like, no, I don't want to live like this anymore. You had this internal sense of integrity of, I want to live out who I am and what I believe for me. Now you're getting incongruence, and that other part got heavier and it tipped the scale. And so the part of you wanting to be congruent got heavy enough that you said, I'm willing to risk this thing. I know I can control, quote unquote, staying in the family and being loved by being false. And actually, it's so much more important to me to be in congruence with myself, to have this internal integrity. That was your identity. Jumping back to the beginning of our conversation, and you said, I've got to be who I am and speak my truth. You know, that's how I see that playing out, that it's not that you couldn't control the other person's response. You absolutely could control it, but you decided, I would rather be okay with me than be okay with them.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
This, by the way, I've got so much going on in my brain. I'm like, what? Let's go. Just like, you know, there's this idea that it's about love, and there's another idea that, like, if you're not, why do you want love? And it's because it's such a safe place, isn't it? It's so nice to be seen and heard, and without love, you feel fucking at risk, right? But how about this, man? Like, essentially, like, if the risk is deep down in you, you're like, well, if I'm not loved, then I might die, right? So I'm gonna live in survival mode in order to be loved, in order to not die. But that's not living anyhow. Being this fake version of you isn't living, it's just surviving anyhow. So in both versions, in some sense, you're dead. Do you see what I mean? Like, is it living if you're not listening to your internal voice?
Right.
So you're dead anyhow. You might as well be yourself. Do you see what I mean? But you're not going to die if you're actually yourself. But I don't know if I've explained that very well, but, like, you know, not surviving isn't living as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, and I often say this to clients, like, you could even, like, what would you rather be, like, liked for this fake version of you, or dislike for the true version of you? And it's funny because actually there's this deep part of us that would rather be disliked for our true selves. And I think that's because it's living. Being a true self is living. So yeah, I've blown it up there, but I think if everyone lived in this suppressed surviving version, I don't think any of us are living anyhow. So what's the fucking point in being liked?
Well, yeah, I think so much of that feeling is just, you know, the remnants of our evolutionary selves, where it's like, you know, 10,000 years ago, 20,000, 100,000 years ago, whatever, it's like you were a part of a group, you were part of a tribe. And if you went outside of that, there was the risk of physical death, you know, predators, other tribes, whatever it might be. So the conformity was the important thing. That sense has never left us, as far as I can tell. But that's not how the world operates anymore, where it's like, if I go outside of the conformity, I'm going to be eaten by a lion. Because for most of us, like, lions, we never encounter a lion, you know, unless the only time we do is, like, they're behind glass at a zoo, or, you know, you're out on safari and, you know, you've got a trained guide who can get you away. Like, so, like, there's so much of that felt sense of, like, if I step out and become my true self, I will physically die, when that's really not the case.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's hard to fight that, like, that lizard brain, that sense of, like, fight or flight, safety, like, you know, it's so hard to fight that.
So when you people please, are you choosing death over living as yourself, really? You know, is conformity actually, in some sense, deciding not to live properly?
You know, like, you could definitely go there. It's like, conformity for me was like no tattoos. Now here I have a bunch of tattoos, and it's like the very first tattoo I got was a cross on my chest, because I'm like, this is never going to change about me, this belief in this religion. Well, here I am 10 plus years after I got that tattoo, and that's no longer the case. Yeah. And so it's like, okay, how do I transition that? So it's like, now it's a tree. Like, I've transitioned, you know, that thing that is permanent into something different that's now permanent, to show the growth and the change and the transition of who I am.
Miriam, before I just realized I said something that I don't believe, and I need to I don't think conformity is bad if it's what feels right for you. So I don't think conformity is survival if it's right. Anyhow, I just thought I would say it. Miriam, what are you thinking? We had a lot of things thrown around here.
Yeah, I'm all over the place. What am I thinking? Well, I'm bouncing back into the space of transitions. I was thinking about how, because we live on two different continents, it's easy to use a metaphor of going from, here to there. If we were to do it in a boat, I would leave from one space knowing firmly I was in the United States, and I don't know where international waters end. But there would come a point in time where I would be nowhere. I would be somewhere, but nowhere. It wouldn't be the waters that belong to the United States, and it wouldn't be the waters that belong to England. And let's actually suppose you lived in Spain and spoke a different language, because we both speak English or all speak English. At some point, I would enter into this other land's waters that has a completely different way of speaking and a completely different culture. And what I have seen in transitions is there is a space where you are pretty confused by the new culture and the new language. You know you're not there, but you keep trying to speak in the same language in the new space. And then you learn the new language and the new culture, and you just like push against the old thing. I'm only going to speak Spanish. I'm not going to speak any English because I'm trying to learn this new thing. And then I space that's even deeper of integration. Rich had talked in one of our meetings about so many of you left the thing you used to be, and you're like, I'm not going to have anything to do with that, whether you were an attorney or a rugby player or a therapist or whatever. And I'm running in my brain this notion of integration, and what does that mean in transition? And Eric, turning your cross into a tree is an amazing example of integration, where you're not getting rid of something, you're integrating it. And what does that look like over time? So I guess in the context of the transition, I'm thinking about spaces of clarity and spaces of confusion, and bouncing into your comment about, doing what feels right. Sometimes, because of your conditioning, the right thing doesn't actually feel right. The right thing feels scary and off and wrong, and connecting into that part of you that is wiser than the previous version, that knows everything in me is quaking and I don't want to do this. This doesn't feel right. This feels awkward. This feels off. But some piece of me knows I need to in order to grow. I'm thinking about all of those things, which is not, that's hard to respond to because I just said a whole bunch of things. But anybody who wants to respond can respond.
I'll jump in. Eric, did you have anything on that? Yeah, I 100% like feel that, because that's that confusing space of like, what's the real me? What's going on here? I kind of know this is right, but it's fucking terrifying. And I think the separate self gets scared, because when you make transitions, it is change, and it wants stasis. It wants to be the same. It wants to be the same. So to the personal self, it is so scary. But the impersonal, true nature of you is just like, no, that's right. And so to me, I feel that I don't mind that fear when I know that the secondary voice, the real one, the real version of me, has that feeling. It's not evidenced because I haven't got a history of it yet, because quite often it's going into the unknown of everything. So as long as that part of me is like, that's the right way to go, I'm quite willing to walk on shaky legs, knowing that it's this illusory separate self that's scared. And I feel recently like my life is playing much more for us, and I'm stepping up for us as much as I'm stepping up for me. And that makes that fear a lot easier to comprehend. It's the right thing, and it'd be the wrong thing to go against the impersonal nature that is probably the real me. But I can't deny that the former version of myself, which was very, very separate, but even in the rugby world, is very, very separate. And it doesn't like it. So it takes a lot of compassion towards myself to say, yeah, thanks, mate. Thank you for getting me here, but like, I've got this. And my ego kind of going, okay, all right, well, I'm gonna sit in the background, and like, if you step out in front of a car, I'll pull you back. But the rest of the time, okay, right. Because deep down, like, even my ego in the conversations that I've had with the younger boy, he said like, oh, you're right. Like, you know what to do. You know what to do. And it's only when I show myself, and to Eric's earlier point of self-compassion or loving yourself, even only when I loved my ego, that it let me be myself, funnily enough. So the self-compassion and love is the thing that allows me to walk on shaky legs. And in terms of the idea of like being in Spain but not talking English because you want to get rid of this old version, I had a similar experience leaving rugby. Like Anne said on the last call I was on with her, she was like, until 2 weeks ago, you never said you played rugby. Because
Really?
Yeah, like, I mean, in private conversations it comes up, but I tried to not talk about it because I want to let go of that. But it's like complete denial of reality to pretend that I didn't actually do that. I wanted to get away from that world, but partly because there's people in that world where it scares me. I want to separate them because I'm like, oh, what would they think about that? But that is not the real me. The real me is just like, it's cool if you to be whoever you want. It's cool to talk about rugby because, and if those people are allowed to think what they want as well. But also that rugby was just, you know, like, we've all got these gifts, but I can talk about it now because it's not like, rugby's not really, it's a bit like the guitar, Eric. It's just a gift that was given to you. Like, you didn't decide it. You just decided that you wanted to play, you played. And it was sort of like, I don't really feel like I owned rugby as a gift, in a sense. It feels like it was just nature giving me something to do, to express myself. And it's okay to now like reflect on that and acknowledge it. When I deny that was part of my journey and nature's journey through me, it's like it's just like the weirdest version of like pretending something didn't happen when it did. So I found like embracing that quite important to me in feeling more comfortable in me now. Like, if I deny that the reality of what happened and who I was or was not being, like, I'm kind of denying reality, and I don't like that feeling.
Mm.
Yeah. Cal, what I appreciate about what you shared, and the reason I used like a sailing metaphor versus a plane, and if you've gone from continent to continent on a plane, I always feel like, whoa, yesterday I was in America and now I'm in, wherever. And it's very disorienting. And I've never taken a boat to know, but people who have say it's interesting because it takes enough time that it allows you the transition. And if anybody is listening to this and going through transition, I guess I want to camp on the fact that it takes time. Eric, for you to be okay with your family knowing you don't believe the same thing as they do anymore, that was not an overnight thing. There was a moment where it got clarified, but I'm guessing there was this internal process that happened for a year or more. And then, this process continues. And Callum, with your rugby, the same thing. There was, the injury was the inciting event, but there was a process of, I'm going to get better. I'm going to get better. Oh, I'm not getting better. Whatever. Now I'm leaving rugby. Now I'm not talking about rugby. Now I am talking about rugby. And, I think, Cal, you have probably done way more work. I don't know how the injury accelerated the work that you did internally. And this isn't a criticism. This is a observation. You speak about it like it was easy. And I guess where I want to camp is it's not as easy to this transition from this to that, or hearing that internal voice and honoring it. I think there's a space where people don't even know that they're dishonoring the internal voice. They're in conflict with themselves and they don't even know. And then there's this space where they know, but they feel hamstrung to like actually honor the internal voice. And then they try it once, like you said, quaky knees, and they feel empowered. And the more they do it, the more it becomes intoxicating to be incongruence. And I guess I want to just say that this business of honoring this truest version of ourselves, you have to fight for that initially. And I love the simplicity with which you speak about it. And I'm like in my heart, I'm going, wow, is it as easy as Cal makes it sound for him? Because I know in my own space, I've had to fight for every inch of congruence. I've had a lot of opposition, and I'm really proud of being able to like be that person, and I'm still in process. I mean, I remember after our last conversation, I reached out to you and I was like, did I sound arrogant? Even still that space of, how did that come across? That, people pleasing, wanting to be my own person, but also showing up. Is that okay? And you're like, oh my gosh, Miriam, were you speaking truth? If you were speaking truth, you're okay. That was really freeing.
Yeah. Okay,
Eric,
wow.
what are you thinking?
Well, like I'm loving this like conversation. I love the analogy of the boat that you're using, of like there is this middle space where there is sort of like there can be nothing, and that's okay, and that's part of the journey. But the thing that's kind of bouncing around my head is there can be a difference between chosen transition and forced transition.
For sure.
It's like, again, I like using stories, and my life is the easiest thing for me to reference. It's like I have a background in corporate America. It's like I graduated from college and went straight into like Fortune 500 companies, went and got my MBA. So it's like that's the world that I come from. And it's like if I use sort of that, the jobs and corporates as an example, it's like an example of a chosen transition would be like, I am quitting this job to take a different job. That is an easier transition, though it's not easy, because now I'm having to learn a new company, potentially a new role, potentially new language. What are the acronyms they use and how are they different? Like, it's like I have been in companies where it's like two different companies use the same 3-letter acronym to mean two different things. And it's like, okay, this used to mean this, that now it means this, like, where is that space? But then there's the forced transitions of like, say, a layoff, and I've experienced that twice in my life. The first one, I experienced all of the feelings of rage, depression, fear, sadness. And in all of those, I didn't take the steps needed to make that transition easier of, at least here in the US, applying for unemployment, doing all these things. So you have still have income coming in. And I had to like move back in with my parents. And so there's that sort of like shame of like, I was living on my own and now I have to go back into like my parents' house. And so that transition is a lot harder. Whereas the second time I was laid off, I had taken all those learnings from that first transition and said, all right, now I know what I need to do. I do this, I do this, I do this. And that transition of unemployment, the first time was like 3 months between the time I got let go and the time I got a new job. Maybe it was longer, but it's 3 to 6 months. The second time was 13 months. Now, granted, that was, during COVID and very few people were hiring and all this kind of stuff. But that was such an, even though they were both forced transitions, the second one was so much easier because I had the learnings from the first one. And I think that's an important part of transition, is remembering every time we've done a transition. What did I learn? How do I make this easier? How do I make this more enjoyable? If it's difficult, like, those are some of the things that have been bouncing around in my head.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I guess I went through a forced transition, right? I sort of think that was easier than in sport. I don't know why it feels easier for me, because when a neurologist is like, oh, you've got scarring on your brain or your memory is lacking in this much and this much, you're like, well, there is no choice. But Miriam, to answer, and I didn't really have, I didn't really have much experience of transition, but it was kind of like I could be at peace with the fact that it was happening because of the medical reasons. But I guess, Miriam, if I'm not coaching you, but when you talked about fighting for the change and the transition, like, I didn't fight. I stopped fighting. I've been fighting all my life physically, like rugby, like on wherever, being violent, and then in my mind as well, like, I was fighting, like, oh, I really want to say this, but no, oh, I feel like I should say this. And actually, the thing that like liberated me was to surrender. I stopped fighting, and that's, I potentially portray it as easy, but it was just being like, oh, I'm just going to let go, like, fuck it, like, fighting's not working. So I felt like the end of the transition was just like, oh, I'm just going to let fucking nature do its thing, and it's led me here. So my answer probably, if I was coaching you, I might say, what does surrender look like if you're thinking about fighting? Since we're in a conversation, I suppose that's yeah, thank you for letting me realize that, because I think I did spend a long time just like, oh, what should I do here? And life's just got so much simpler for me when I don't, my ego overcomplicates everything. And it's like, should you say this? Should you say this? And we're just like, oh, fuck it. Like, surrender. Just like, well, it feels right to say this. It feels right to own that I played rugby. It feels right to say, and it's not only surrender to, but it's like letting go of anger and complication and ego, and it's embracing love. It's just coming from your heart, and it's constantly going, what is the loving answer to this all the time? And that is exactly what happened with my ego. I showed my ego, I showed the little boy some love, and he sort of let go of me. And that's exactly what happened in my transition away from rugby. I realized that half of the reason I played rugby was ego as well. I wanted to like stand over people and feel stronger than them. That made me safe. And then
this is that's such a good response, and I love it. It is, I guess, having met with a gazillion people in my therapeutic career, not in my coaching career, I find your space to be really curious and unusual. That isn't how I've seen it play out for most people, maybe because of the homeostatic space of, life wanting to stay the same. But I love that perspective. And I would also be curious about surrender to chosen transition, or I'm sorry, surrender to transition that was put upon you versus fighting for the transition that you are pursuing or wanting. And I would say you and I were in very different spaces as far as what we were transitioning from. And unfortunately, and I feel so sad because this is really unfair for me to say, I got to bounce.
Oh,
And with that, I have to bounce.
yeah.
But this has been so great, you guys, and I assume you'll continue talking if you want, and
Yeah.
please do. And I'm sad I just had this other meeting I have to go to, but you guys are the best.
Oh, thank you so much. Love you.
Yeah, much
Love
love,
you too.
Miriam.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Wow, that was cool, wasn't it? She's
Yeah.
I love the way Miriam thinks. I love people that when I'm speaking, they just come from that different angle, and I'm like, oh wow, that's a new way of looking at things, and it kind of shifts your world all of a sudden.
Yeah, it shifts your world, and it's like there's those people in your life that it's like they have such that impact even across sort of like the virtual space. It's like I've had the pleasure of like being in the same physical space as Miriam, and it's just like you magnify that by like 10. That just that sense of like radiance and just love and like
Yeah.
curiosity, and it's like that's why I love people like Miriam. It's just like they are genuinely curious, they're genuinely themselves, and you can feel that and you want to emulate that.
Yeah. I also think that her background in therapy, because I think in coaching we can kind of talk in theory a lot and ideals, which I think is super important, but at the same time, like when you've been a therapist and seen some things, I think it's nice to kind of ground it all. As much as I think all of this is just reality anyhow that we're speaking about, it's nice to hear about it from the other angle. I'm curious.
Real quick, I was going to say, like, I think yes, I agree with you, but I think it's also important not to like romanticize or like put other professions up on a pedestal, like, oh, because you have this, you've instantly seen more. It's like we've all seen shit in our lives where it's just like, oh my God, like you've seen things on the rugby pitch that I will have never seen. I've seen things in the corporate world that you will have never seen. And it's about bringing those lived experiences, whether we physically experience them or just observed them, into the space as learnings and stories and like growth opportunities.
Yes, exactly. I wouldn't necessarily, in fact, I've not really enjoyed it in my past when people have said, oh, well, you don't have experience with this, so you can't speak about this. And you're like, man, like, true equality is that all of our perspectives are equally valuable. What I recognize is, so I'm not necessarily like putting more weight on what Miriam says. It's just, it comes at such a different angle to where I come from. So,
right.
And ultimately, like through listening to different perspectives, my own one broadens, my world gets a lot bigger. I suppose my empathy grows with that. Where are you at in terms of transition then in your head in this conversation? Do you want to move further with it, or?
I mean, yeah, I think I don't know how much more there is in there. Like, it's like, I think transitions are like can be very, very difficult, even if you're physically the one choosing to make the transition. whether it's, profession, where you live. It's like, I've experienced that where it's like, I was born in Colorado in the central US, and at the age of 8, my family moved to Washington. So it's like, that wasn't really my choice, but now I have to learn how to make new friends, like learn a new area, new climates, all of these things. Versus like, I am physically, like like the first job that I was let go from, I physically chose to go to a different state. Like, it was in a completely different state. So it's like, I am the one choosing to make the move.
Yeah.
Like, that was very difficult, because it's like, I had never lived by myself before. And now all of a sudden, like, how do I budget for one? How do I pay the bills when I'm not splitting it with anybody?
Yeah.
Like, there's just all of these things in life where it's like, we can trivialize sometimes transitions as simple or easy, but underneath the surface, depending on no matter how the person presents to their friends or their family or just the public in general, like, there is turmoil, there is challenge, there's struggle. So I think it's learning how to, one, acknowledge that in a transition you struggle, and two, how do you ask for help in those times of struggle?
Yeah. God, I had a few things going on there. I was thinking, like, in my mind, forced transition when there's no choice makes it really easy, but then it doesn't, because what if, so in my case, I could no longer play rugby anymore, but what if in your case, you're forced out, but you could still do that thing? So the context of still being able to continue to do that thing makes that hard. And then I was thinking, God, a really, really tough transition is where you love what you do and potentially your family enjoy where they are. And then there's this other part of you is like, but I'd love even more to go here. So this deep sense of wanting to go over here, but this one also is good. And I bet that one is a really, really hard transition where you're letting go of something that you love, because it's kind of probably easier in a job if you hate your manager, but you'd rather try that. It's almost like the trauma of the current experience makes that easy. But then that whole, like, it's the opposite of a rock and a hard place. It's like a really nice place and an even nicer place. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, there's also, like, we're talking about like the challenge that we face internally, those struggles, but there's also the externalities or the external things that cause the transition to be even harder. So using the example of like moving, it's like, I would absolutely love to move and live to a different country.
Yeah.
I would love that experience of like just completely uprooting and planting myself in a different culture, whether it's the same language spoken or not, just to experience that. But the bureaucracy that's involved with that, as far as like visas and all of these things, can be very, very difficult and very, very challenging. And those are things that are out of our control. Like, I can't control the rules that another country has in place to say like that you can live there for, more than 3 months or 6 months or whatever it might be. So it's like, how do you then deal with mentally, how do you prepare yourself to say like, I am making this choice in this transition for something that I see as a betterment to myself, knowing that I have all of this red tape and all of this shit that I have to get through. And will that make that transition so hard that I no longer want to make it?
Well, I think you answered it. I think it's knowing that it's the reason why you're doing it is for the positive. And if you didn't move because you're like, so it's a movement towards positivity instead of a movement away out from difficulty. Do you see what I mean? So like, if you're moving abroad because you really want to go, that's great. If you're not moving because you don't want to, because you're scared or because you don't want to experience the hassle, that is not a positive reason for staying where you are. You're staying where you are out of scarcity and negativity. And so I know I can kind of make these things sound like overly simple, but that is the choice for me at the end of the day. Like, and one is the choice of love. One is the choice of like following my heart and what feels right. And one is the denial of what feels right. And James, often when I talk to James, he makes things simple because he's like, what's your heart saying? You know, what's real Callum saying? I'm like, holy shit, because, you know, I was coaching someone around this idea the other day, and they said, oh, you know, I love working, but then going out on the weekends, like, really messes up work, but I also really want to live and have weekends. And I said, okay, well, what's the decision that is made when you're out and you continue to party longer than, like, you know, it, to the extent that it starts affecting you next week? And it goes, and they said, well, it's actually that I don't want to miss out on, you know, FOMO, fear of missing out. And I said, but can you see how that's negatively charged? It's not that you want to stay out, it's that you don't want to miss out.
Right.
If you wanted to stay out because you wanted more experience, I can understand that. If it's a fear of something being taken away from you, that's a completely different reason. And that does come back to ego versus true self. So I think when you're making those decisions in transition, it's make sure that it's the positive movement, not the one out of scarcity, away from fear and difficulty.
Right. No, absolutely. I love that, like, the distinction of, like, that you mentioned. And one of the things that, you know, I remember James telling both of us is, like, switch it to the JOMO, the joy of missing out.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, you're never going to be able to experience everything. So experience the things that you truly want.
Yes.
And then be okay with missing out on everything else.
Yeah.
Because that experience of experiencing what you really, really want is going to be so much more enjoyable and impactful than trying to pack everything in.
Yeah. And in a lot of those cases, it's a life where it is almost, you're doing those things out of survival. It's like, oh, I want to be seen to be at this event. I want to be seen to be here and here, or not to miss out on it. And so to a certain extent, I think that doing everything in some sense could be that you are not really living in line with yourself. You're kind of living really in line with your ego and yourself at the same time. And it's that confusing state. So my sort of like end feeling in this situation is just to make sure that we're coming from a place of love. And what I mean by that is just the most positive reason, not out of scarcity and lack.
Yeah, it for me, it all comes back to where we started this conversation of, like, that sense of identity. If my identity is wrapped up in the experience that other people perceive that I'm having, it's not as powerful.
Yeah.
But if I am doing something, whether it's going out for drink with friends or traveling to another country or moving or taking a new job or whatever it might be, because it is in the true alignment and congruency with who I am and what I want.
Yeah.
That's where magic happens.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to address the last two things we spoke around, and I mentioned, and we've got a little bit of time, so if you're happy to, I wanted to talk about expectations and pressure. And I actually feel like your story has a lot of both of those. Expectations probably from your family, pressure from your family, and mine too. I think that they're probably linked. And I often give this example to clients, and I say, well, you know, is pressure real? And they go, yeah, it is. And I go, are you sure? I'm like, what do you mean? I go, well, you know, if my granddad, if Justin Gatlin races Usain Bolt, loads of pressure. If my granddad races Usain Bolt, no pressure. So is pressure not something that we create through expectations? I want to, and then even around your family, I wonder how much of it's a pressure that you create for them to like you and live up to it's almost, but your perception of their expectations and your want to meet their expectations creates pressure. And I want to like point the finger towards myself here, because I really don't want you to feel like the last one we were talking about you, and I don't want you to feel like you're different, because I experienced literally everything that I said to you, I experienced myself. But people have expectations of me and probably who I was. At least I think they do. And when I try to live up to that through my ego, it creates enormous amount of pressure to live up to the perceived, and I'll call it perceived because I don't even know that they have expectations of me. And so I think it's funny, because as I'm speaking and I wanted to talk about expectations and pressure, I realized how much of it I create. And I do really think we create our worlds. And yeah, I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
No, I don't know if I've ever really thought about it that way, but I can I'm like laughing internally, because it's like, yeah, like so much of that pressure we feel about sort of like the expectations of others, I think is self-imposed. Now, there is, I do think that there are times where there are expectations and pressures that are like imposed onto us. I think, job, like a job is a good example of that, where it's like you are hired to do a certain thing. So there are these expectations that you will do these things. And if you're, coming up on a deadline or whatever, it's like you can get that pressure to say, like, we need to get this done. So it's like, I don't think all of it is self-imposed, but I think most of the time, the things that we feel are internally created. Those expectations of others, those pressures that we think others have of us, is stuff that we just sort of like create in our brain of like, oh my God, am I like, I'm overthinking this? Like, do they love me? Am I going to be accepted? Like, I think that's where my head's going.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you've got these kind of agreed commitments, I don't know if there's a difference potentially between commitments and expectations, but about work, for example. And then you said you feel this pressure, but then I was thinking about it. It's like, but is the pressure, what's the pressure? Because like, if you don't get it done, you do your best and it's 6 o'clock on a Friday and everyone else fucks off and you're left there, like you feel the pressure, but what's it really about? It's about someone else's judgment of what you've done, probably, because if you've got that self-approval that you've done your best, then the pressure comes from wanting someone else to like to approve of you. And that is something that you can control, I think. I think we create pressure of wanting to impress people.
Right. And I think what's interesting, like thinking back, so it's like my longest career stretch was with Expedia. And like I specifically worked within sort of their business travel side of things. And so it's like all of our clients were other corporate clients, booking their business travel. And my role was sort of like account rep, account support. And there was always the pressure that I felt from the clients to be able to answer the question, solve the problem, whatever it might be. And it's like, I took that and it's like, okay, where is that pressure coming from? Is that something that I'm putting on myself? Or is that something that the client feels that they are getting pressured from their company? And so they're externally projecting pressure that they're feeling onto myself. And there was one day, like early on in that role, where it's like we took a half day, the entire group, like team of sales and account management. We went to a rooftop bar in Seattle, and the company paid for us to have, beers and play shuffleboard out in the sun. And it was just like, I remember standing there being like, what is this? That we can just take a half a day. Like, yeah. I'm thinking about all these things and these emails that are going to be facing me and the pressure and expectations. And my VP comes up to me, and I will never forget this. because I'm kind of standing on the sidelines and I'm feeling that weight and those expectations and that pressure that I'm anticipating that clients are going to be having towards me. And I think he felt that. And he just kind of stood next to me and just kind of smiled. He's like, it's nice, isn't it? I'm like, yeah. He's like, we're not saving babies. Everything can wait.
Yeah, that's the one. That's it.
And it's just like, I'm like, oh, that's right. Like, I am putting the pressure and expectation on myself as if I am a pediatric surgeon.
Yes.
Trying to save the life of this infant.
Yes.
When in reality, I'm answering an email about somebody who couldn't hit buy now on an airplane.
Yeah.
For a flight. Like, it's not the end of the world.
And you know it's not the end of the world because you're able to go to the bar with your friends and your colleagues and no one died.
Right.
And you didn't die. And so that's what I mean. Like, what is the pressure? Ultimately, I think, you know, to rewind to what you said earlier, there's this idea that you need to be liked. And because if you're not liked, it's death, or has been. But then you're just not living in reality. And I think that's why that pressure is so icky. I don't really know why I said icky actually, but that's sort of like, but it's not real. It's not real. And what am I fucking worried about? And you're not, right. You're not playing in reality. You're playing in this made up thing. And you kind of know it as well, because you're sitting there and you're like, it's a fucking holiday for someone that's computer doesn't function correctly. Like, this is not, it's not a threat to me. It doesn't determine me. It's nothing to do with my identity. So on one half, you're like, I know this isn't important in some respects. And then the other part of you is like, no, get it fucking done, because you need people to like you. And right. You kind of just, it's funny. I always think about that idea. You play it out with clients, and I know James does this as well, and he spoke around it, is that you play out like, well, what will happen? What will happen if you don't get back to that email? Well, then the client will get really angry. Okay, and what will happen then? Well, they might inform my manager. What will happen then? Well, your manager might speak to you and they might fire you. What will happen then? Well, just get another job. Like, okay, so your worst case scenario is you have to find another job. Well, Eric, how many times have you done that? Well, I've done it 3 or 4 times in my life. Okay, did you die in any of those occasions? No. Looking back, did change actually help you and grow? Like, yeah, okay, well, maybe the best thing that, we don't know, but maybe a good thing is going to come from all of this.
One of the most powerful things that I've experienced, one of the very first coaches that I ever hired, like, we were doing that sort of simulation of like, well, what could happen if you make this decision?
Yeah.
What then? What then? And we got to the end of it and he's like, did you know that everything you just said was a negative perception?
Yeah.
Everything was negative. This could go wrong. This could go wrong. This could go wrong. This could go wrong. He's like, let's start over, but you're not allowed to say anything negative.
Yeah.
What's the positive that could come from this action or this outcome or whatever? And I was just like, oh shit. Like, our default, I think, at least for me, I'll speak from my experience, is this to this is a negative. Me going for drinks with my mates, colleagues, I saw all the negatives.
Yeah.
Versus the positives of like building the relationships and having fun and being out in the sun and just like gelling as a community, versus like, someone's gonna be mad at me because I didn't answer an email within 4 hours and it took 8 instead. Like,
yeah,
like,
yeah. I'm 100% with you. And God, we could go in loads of directions here. This is why I think pressure is so made up, because you can sit there in the reactivity and do absolutely fuck all and nothing changes. And it's like, it was not real. It was a story in my head. And what I heard your coach doing was to kind of say to you, well, this negativity is all built out of your ego. Now let's play in what, like, the possibility, which is that abundance state of like all the positives that could come from, which associate more with probably the real you,
Right.
You know, and it quite often happens that is exactly what happens when you start to play out the positives eventually, because nearly every bad thing that's ever happened to me, good things come from. And I was thinking about so often I coach people, and they come to me and they want to be more productive on, you know, all of their worries are work based, and they're all like, I need to do more, and it's all through the lens of productivity, right?
Right.
And then you talk to them about the most important things, you know, this stoic idea of negative visualization, wanting what you already have. You say to them, if I took everything from you right now, health, friends, family, your mind, freedom, everything, what would you want back? So often, and I'll just play this out quick, but it's like loved ones, health and freedom, or friends, family, health.
Yeah.
Go, right. Well, and if I took them from you, how would you feel? And they're like, it would be the end of the world for me. Like, it would feel awful. And then you go, well, you can have those three things back, or you can choose something else. Would you want anything else? And they're like, no, I want those three things back right now. And you go, well, imagine, like, see how rich you are. You've got all of the things that you most want in the world, you already have, right? And then they're like, oh shit. Then that gets them into that abundant sort of mindset. And then you say, well, see, you didn't mention work as any of the three most important things. So let's change the word from productivity to contribution, right? What changes when you think about contribution to the world and the things that are important to you? What changes? And they're like, fucking hell, all I've been focusing on is something that isn't that important to me. Well, definitely not in the top three. And because of the stress that's causing me, I'm not adding to the three most important parts of my life: my health, my friends, and my family, or my exercising, my freedom, health, and family. And you think we can get so wrapped up in this false pressure from this narrative that our ego creates, that the only important thing is work and the transition from work to work. We actually forget about the really important things that we could be contributing to. I spoke to someone else the other day, and they were in transition, and I said, what are you doing with your days? They're like, I just feel really shit, so I'm not really doing much. You think, well, what? I actually spoke to James about this, but eventually, like, they have this opportunity in the transition period to be with their friends, family, and spend time on their health more than ever, because they're waiting for this next job. But this thing that's not that important, because they've created pressure around it, has stopped them enjoying the fact that they've got the thing that they already wanted right in front of them, and they're not. Life is here and now. I was also thinking about this idea of, like, you know, the past is a memory, and a memory you access now. The future is imagination. Your imagination you access now. It's even the past and the future are right here and now. And sometimes the pressure is created by living into something which doesn't exist. The imagination, what will happen if? And it really retracts from the fact that you're on a rooftop bar. To circle this all around, you're at a rooftop bar with your boss, who's just like, mate, it's all good. Like, enjoy this beer, like, have a laugh. And it's so much of it can distract from the only important thing, which is those three things, and the here and now.
Yeah, I like that's transition of, like, productivity to contribution, because it's like, when I hear productivity, I hear, like, how am I helping somebody else or some other entity meet their bottom line,
right?
Versus contribution is, how am I contributing to my bottom line,
right?
You know, the things that are most important to me. And that doesn't even have to be from a monetary, like, I want to make $1 million or what, like, take the money side out of it, but like you said, like that, those friends, those families, like the health, like the relationship, the things that make us feel whole and special and valued, and like, how can I contribute in such a way that those things grow?
Yeah, it goes all the way back to identity. If you think you're your job title, you
Mhm.
create expectations, and you create all your function around that. Is you forget that you're a brother, a sister, a father, a son, a friend, a human, like you that your body exists. You forget of all the things that, like, other things you could be contributing to, because your identity is so wrapped up in one thing, creates a heap of pressure. And I think about it, I used to have like bad days at rugby or whatever, and I'd go home and like be an arsehole to Lucy, or I'd have a bad game and not talk to my friends. And it's like, Jesus Christ, your identity is so wrapped up in one thing that ultimately is impermanent anyhow. Definitely rugby is impermanent. And then the things that might be around for your life, for the rest of your life, that are really truly important to you, that you wouldn't change for rugby in a second, you're giving nothing to. And a client recently said to me, like, the biggest risk is that I sacrifice today worrying about tomorrow. And I was just like, oh, that is 100% it. It's the pressures that we create that take away from the opportunity that's right here and now in this great conversation. And the next one, and the next one. And I hope that I remember that. I hope that I remember, no matter like whether a client resigns or whether a new, person wants me as a coach, that when that phone call goes down, the best version of me contributes to my loved ones, my health, and my friends. And I hope that I never forget that, because too much of the time in the past, something which is not that important is really detracted from my contribution to the things that are important.
Yeah, I love that it always just comes back to like that identity piece, and just saying like, if you put your identity in the hands of somebody else, you're going to feel the expectations and pressure.
Yes.
But if you can own who you are and contribute in a way that is growing who you are and the people around you, like I said, like magic is going to happen when you can make that mindset shift.
Yeah.
And it's hard. That transition is hard.
Yeah.
Because especially at least here in the US, like everything about you go to a party, hey, what's your name? What do you do? Those are the first two questions when you meet someone new.
Yeah.
Because it's like, that's the easy thing. That's like, it's scary to be vulnerable and to share who you are, especially if you don't know who you are, if all you are is that identity wrapped up in. And then you have these expectations of like, oh, well, I need to be able to sell myself to this other person, this pressure of like, let me like puff my chest up and, oh, I'm a VP of this, or I work for this crazy company, or like, that's, things start falling down. Like you feel that.
Yeah. But that's a choice, right? Like you can just turn around and be like, hey, I'm Eric. What do I do? Well, I do a lot of things. I love guitar. You don't have to jump into the job title. I often think about this. People don't ask for my job title very often, but they do ask what I do. And so I could say, oh, I'm a transformational and executive coach. Or I could say, I help people be all of themselves to create deep happiness, because that's to create deep happiness and high performance, because that's what I do, really what I do. It's not the job title. And I think that's kind of like my powerful place to come from. Instead of like refer to the job title, which is what everyone's doing, is to really own from my being what my doing is.
Right. And instantly, like you said, like, here's, I create deep happiness and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, instantly I'm drawn in and I'm like, ooh, tell me more.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm a coach. cool. What about you? Like instantly, like I
Yeah,
have this expectation, like I'm putting my sort of perceptions and expectations on like what the word coach means or whatever
yeah,
onto you versus being curious. Whereas like you're saying, oh, yeah, coaching is just a tool.
yes,
Like,
exactly. Yes.
like, but what I actually do is help people make this transition, this transformation.
Yes. Yeah. And even that to a certain extent, like it's still a doing thing. It's not my identity. But
Right.
I suppose that's how we've created it. But you can answer in any way you want. I think it's probably quite a fun thing to play around. It's ego sacrificing to be like, well, I don't know if I do much, but if you're talking about my being, this is my being.
Right.
It's very interesting. Wow, man, we're coming up to 2 hours.
Yeah.
I wanted to know, have you had like a key takeaway or insight or something that just springs to mind from this conversation?
I think for me, I think a couple of things stand out. I think, I think identity, like everything comes back to like who you are as like a person and your identity. I think that's something that I've been really like working through and trying to dig more into over the last couple of months. And so it's like, even when we're talking about expectations and pressure and transitions and all these kind of things, it's like all of these things are made easier when you have that true sort of, or a truer identity of self, that love and compassion for who you are. But I also, something that you had just recently said, this idea of like, am I sacrificing today, worrying about tomorrow? Like that really struck me as like, because I can get so caught up in my head of like, well, what about tomorrow? Am I worried about like this person signing, this person, like, whatever it might be? It's like, that's wasted energy.
Hmm.
It's like, how do I worry about today?
Yeah.
How do I focus on today so that tomorrow is better versus tomorrow needs to be better and then never doing anything about it.
Yeah, like that's the irony, isn't it? If you want to have a better tomorrow, like focus on today anyhow. Focus
Right.
on anything that you can control, which is just right here and now. I guess for me, a couple of things is like, I don't know why I feel compelled to say this, but it's like simplify by surrendering, which is like make your life simple by surrendering to that feeling of what you should be doing and just let go of the egoic stuff. And the answers are there. I feel like all the answers are right in that place. And who you are being is the answer. And being your true self is the game. That's where the answers are. I think, you mentioned magic happening. I think that's what happens when you just get into being yourself.
Yep. I agree.
Well, I really like this conversation, man. Energizing.
It's been great. Like just feeling like that, like that, just like things are moving in my body right now. I'm just like, oh,
Yeah.
keep going.
Love it. Oh, thank you so much for being you, mate.
Yeah, you as well.